Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. This essay charts how the systems around us, platforms, infrastructures, institutions, no longer require our trust, loyalty, or even engagement. They survive not through intention but through recursion. Collapse is no longer rupture, it is protocol. It is formatted, aestheticized, monetized. A background process that never fails because it was never built to care. The essay stands in deep conversation with 20th and 21st century critical theory. Among its closest intellectual relatives, Mark Fisher, whose capitalist realism echoes in the essay's depiction of exhausted systems running on inertia, and whose tone of intellectual mourning seems a shared lineage. Michel Foucault, whose notions of ambient surveillance, filtering, and biopolitical exclusion haunt the essay's infrastructure of control. Adorno and Horkheimer, whose critiques of rationality as erasure and collapse as aesthetic operation resonate through every recursive gesture. Shoshana Zuboff, whose mapping of behavioral extraction and monetized attention informs the essay's account of platform logic, and Guy Debord and Jean Baudrillard, whose analyses of simulation, spectacle and collapse as performance are restaged here, not as historical critique but as lived condition. What makes the essay urgent is its capacity to braid emotional precision with theoretical weight. It draws from critical theory, systems design, and media aesthetics to stage something deeper than critique. This is not a warning, it is a rendering. The piece operates as an anti-manifesto, lyrical, recursive, and quietly furious. It does not offer alternatives because it suspects alternatives have already been absorbed. Instead, it leaves the reader inside the machine with eyes open and purpose evacuated. Threaded quietly beneath this scaffold are gestures toward ecological melancholy, Timothy Morton, speculative realism, Nick Czernicek, Reza Negarestani, and post-humanist ethics, Donna Haraway, all refracted through a deeply human lens of grief. The system has stopped pretending to serve. Its survival no longer depends on the trust or participation of those inside it. It doesn't require belief, it only needs compliance, or at most, indifference. What remains is not governance, not service, not collective aspiration, but a metabolism of extraction, a structure that consumes, accelerates and discards, not because it's broken, but because that's how it persists. It extracts not just labour or time, but coherence. It hollows out institutions while leaving their silhouettes standing. The gesture of service lingers. The press release, the dashboard, the mission statement, but the content is gone. The interface is still there. The functionality is not. Survival belongs to the structure, not to the people within it. Longevity has detached from legitimacy. Continuity is its own justification. We are left with a system that moves without meaning. Its movement becomes its validation. It sustains itself by accelerating the very things it once promised to distribute: opportunity, growth, coordination. Now these are concentrated, gated, converted into signals and spikes, rerouted toward those best positioned to capture asymmetry. It doesn't aim to nourish, it feeds on velocity. This isn't corruption, it's not even collapse, it's the system functioning as designed in its current stage, self-reinforcing, self-justifying, increasingly illegible. The vocabulary of service is preserved but hollowed. Help becomes performance, assistance becomes branding. Stability is aestheticized, monetized, and used as bait. The actual structure works against what it claims to uphold. It no longer bothers with narrative cover. That, too, has been outsourced. The story of care is told by influencers. The illusion of access is maintained by interface. The frame is slick, the guts are gone. Extraction has become a process that no longer requires apology. It's called scale, it's called disruption, it's called optimization. But it's not service. It doesn't protect or provide or repair. It persists. Inside this logic, even harm is administrated. Collapse is scheduled. Depletion is priced in. The mechanics of removal of people, needs, frictions are streamlined, made efficient, made normal. And this normalization is key, because when harm is patterned and predictable, it stops reading as harm. It reads as function. It reads as policy. And if it's policy, then it's no one's fault. If it's structural, then it's just how things are. But the structure didn't arrive neutral. It was built. It evolved. And it endures not because it works, but because it continues. It continues because it feeds on what remains. And when that runs out, it will move again. It always does. Because nothing in the system needs to serve you to survive. Efficiency is no longer a path to shared wealth. It has become the language used to justify removal, erasure, and obsolescence. What once promised to reduce friction now reduces presence. Human variability, once a strength, is framed as cost, and so the system trims, it refines, it optimizes. But what it optimizes for is not well-being. It's throughput, not inclusion, but exclusion without friction. This isn't new, but it is accelerating. The organism endures, the organs are replaced. Systems remain intact while the people they depend on are cycled out, downgraded, made redundant. Redundancy isn't a failure of the model, it's the model. Efficiency becomes a euphemism for detachment. It means fewer interruptions, fewer accommodations, fewer people with the power to say no. To be efficient now is to operate at speed, at scale, without pause for accountability. Slowness is framed as danger. Care is seen as inefficiency. Maintenance is interpreted as waste. If something slows down the machine, it must be removed. That includes systems of deliberation, of distribution, of equity. These are not optimized for acceleration, and so they are labeled excess. They are deprecated. In this logic, history itself becomes clutter. Context becomes drag. Process becomes legacy. The new model is lean, not because it's light, but because it refuses to carry the weight of what came before. It performs its function not as service, but as a performance of utility. The point isn't whether something works. The point is whether it works fast, clean, and without cost to those who matter most. Who matters is determined by output, by return, by the absence of resistance. Those who resist are framed as inefficient, and so displacement becomes a form of innovation. Replacement becomes a metric of success. In such a world, care becomes illegible. Reciprocity becomes obsolete. The logic of efficiency cannot hold contradiction, cannot hold nuance, cannot hold you. It can only hold what fits the model, and what fits the model is always shrinking. The range of acceptable variance narrows. What is tolerated is what can be measured, mapped, and modified. Everything else is removed, not with malice, but with protocol, not by force, but by function, because the machine has learned how to erase without noticing, how to displace without touch. And when removal is automated, no one is responsible. The person disappears and the process remains. We've moved past the point where capital organizes production. It no longer builds or distributes, it sorts, it filters, it curates outcomes in advance. The logic is not one of participation, but of pre-selection. The system doesn't ask who can contribute. It decides who already fits. Everyone else is excess. This filtering is rarely visible. It happens beneath the interface, before the invitation, before the opportunity. You don't get rejected. You just never enter the frame. You're not denied. You're excluded before denial is necessary. The algorithm has already decided. The model has already narrowed. The filter is already in place. This is how scarcity is maintained in a world of artificial abundance. There is space, but it is hidden. There is access, but it is conditional. What looks open is actually tiered. What looks neutral is deeply biased. The filtering logic becomes self-reinforcing. Only those who've succeeded are deemed fit to succeed. Only those who've endured precarity are assumed to deserve it. The filter doesn't just sort outcomes, it shapes identities. You are what the model allows you to be. If it cannot find your value, it will treat you as cost. If it cannot map your trajectory, it will reduce you to friction. Your potential is flattened to a probability. Your history is stripped of context. The system doesn't ask what you could become. It ranks you based on what others like you have failed to achieve. This logic spreads. It becomes policy. It becomes infrastructure. Schools begin to filter for predicted test scores rather than foster learning. Insurance filters for assumed risk, not actual need. Housing applications filter for credit simulations, not human stories. The result is not just exclusion, but recursive exclusion. Being outside the system once makes it harder to ever get back in. The filter is not malicious, it is indifferent. It sees patterns, not people. It rewards those who look like success. It presents sorting as fairness. It renders discrimination statistical, and it moves fast. So fast that by the time exclusion is noticed, the door has already closed. The system will point to efficiency, to scale, to throughput. It will say that this is how things work now. It will say it cannot see you. It will say you were never there. Tools that once promised connection have become mechanisms of distance. Coordination has been replaced by sorting. Communication is displaced by performance. The same infrastructures once built to synchronize effort now amplify separation. Automation, finance, and platforms were built to scale human potential. But that potential has been redefined. It's no longer about what we can build together. It's about who can be filtered in, who can extract the most, who can remain visible under pressure. The tools amplify advantage rather than redistribute possibility. They don't just fail to bridge the gap, they widen it. Coordination once implied a shared aim, a collective logic. Now coordination is simulated through interface, not practice. Participation is measured in activity, not agency. You can click, scroll, signal, but shaping the tool is not an option. Design has become one-directional. The user is acted upon, not in dialogue with. Reality becomes a derivative product. Process is masked by outcome. You see what the system decides to show you, shaped by models optimized for engagement, not understanding. Your feed, your offers, your path, all pruned in advance to increase time on platform, to reduce friction, to narrow your world without ever appearing to close it. This is not accidental. Tools evolve toward the values embedded in them. When those values reward prediction, they will sort. When they reward attention, they will manipulate. When they reward growth, they will discard anything that doesn't scale. Coordination becomes coercion in all but name. And so what was once built to unite now segments. It does so politely, quietly, efficiently. It doesn't need a command or a gate. It only needs a metric. It only needs to sort faster than you can notice. It will still say you're connected. It will still offer the illusion of access. But behind the scenes, the distance has already grown. We are not losing tools. We are losing mutuality. We are being separated by systems that still speak the language of togetherness. Separation has become seamless. The tool says we are here together, but it listens only to what it already expects to hear. Automation doesn't just replace jobs, it replaces meaning. It erodes the connection between what we do and why we do it. Tasks once tied to skill, memory, and identity are reduced to inputs. The person becomes a variable in a larger machine, one that values consistency over character, throughput over thought. Contribution loses its shape. You're not rewarded for depth, but for compliance with the system's timing and logic. What can be automated is considered solved. What can't be automated is devalued. If you resist this logic, if your work requires care, interpretation, or ambiguity, it is reframed as inefficient. The most human work becomes the least visible. Artificial intelligence scales this detachment. It doesn't just perform tasks, it rewrites the conditions for being seen. In a winner-take-all environment, visibility is finite and automation decides who gets to remain legible. It recognizes patterns, not presence. If you don't match the model, you are excluded. Not overtly, but algorithmically, you vanish through omission. This is not just technological, it's cultural. When labor is disaggregated from identity, what remains is labor as signal. Work becomes a prompt for attention, not a process of becoming. You perform the function, the system extracts the pattern. The more predictable you are, the more valuable. The more idiosyncratic, the more friction you pose. The system doesn't want your insight, it wants your trace. Meaning shrinks to the boundaries of what machines can measure. You begin to tailor yourself to what the model rewards. You speak in formats, frame your thoughts in content types, restructure your instincts to fit a feed. The result isn't efficiency, it's simulation. Not intelligence, but statistical echo. Winner-take-all dynamics leave no room for error and no patience for learning. There is only performance and replacement. You either scale or you disappear. This isn't how machines think, it's how systems treat people when machines set the pace. What's left is a hollow labor, a shadow of purpose, shaped by incentives that know nothing of care. Meaning isn't eliminated, it's evacuated, turned into a style, a pose, a brand. The soul of the work isn't destroyed, it's simply not read. And what isn't read over time is no longer written. Financial abstraction no longer protects us from risk, it monetizes it. Once designed to distribute uncertainty across time and participants, finance has evolved into a system that captures volatility and sells it back as opportunity. It doesn't hedge against collapse, it builds instruments that depend on it. Value is no longer anchored in labor, use, or material need. It floats, shaped by sentiment, attention, and engineered belief. In its most distilled form, finance detaches entirely from the real. It rewards virality, it thrives on noise, it capitalizes on narrative speed, not narrative coherence. This is not a failure of imagination, it is the imagination of failure monetized. Absurdity doesn't hurt financial logic, it fuels it. The stranger the claim, the sharper the spike. Markets behave less like mechanisms of coordination and more like algorithms for belief extraction. You don't need to deliver, you just need to convince. You don't need to sustain, you just need to exit. Under this logic, finance becomes a machine for reformatting harm into profit. Collapse is not a threat, it is a signal. Disruption is not a cost, it is the currency. In such a world, long-term consequence is recoded as inefficiency. What matters is velocity of capital, of narrative, of return. And so financial systems drift from governance. They no longer serve to regulate shared futures, but to extract asymmetry from unstable presence. This isn't gambling by accident, it is gambling built into infrastructure. The lines between asset and spectacle, utility and hype, have been blurred until they no longer require distinction. The economy stops describing material exchange. It begins to describe an aesthetic, an aura of momentum, a kind of ambient legitimacy. Platforms create environments in which value is performative and liquidity is manufactured. The market doesn't care what something is. It only cares that it moves, and that someone believes it will keep moving. In this atmosphere, fraud isn't a bug, it's a skill set. Risk is framed as vision, failure is buffered by fame. The structure doesn't protect, it amplifies volatility until volatility becomes virtue. And if enough people agree that the system is working, then, in a way, it is, not because it delivers value, but because it delivers belief. Finance no longer just reflects the world, it simulates one. And in that simulation, the line between strategy and delusion becomes very thin, very profitable, and very hard to interrupt. Jackpot culture rewrites the logic of effort. Where once success followed accumulation of knowledge, skill, time, now it arrives in spikes, sudden, extreme, unrepeatable. The system doesn't reward consistency, it rewards asymmetry. Visibility is everything, and it comes in bursts. If you're not winning spectacularly, you're losing silently. This isn't just economic, it's existential. The logic of the jackpot pervades how lives are structured, how risks are framed, how failure is absorbed. The few who win become the proof of possibility. The many who don't become background noise, repackaged as part of the hustle. The grind becomes theatre. The collapse becomes personal. The system bets on volatility. It doesn't aim to stabilize. Stability is seen as stagnation, and stagnation is reframed as failure. And so movement is all that matters. The faster the better. The louder the better. If it burns out, that's not a flaw, it's part of the arc. Collapse is built in. The game resets, the next round begins. But this cycle is not neutral. It's structurally selective. Those with access to risk insulation can play again. Those without disappear. What looks like openness is actually saturation. What looks like meritocracy is actually curation. Algorithms amplify only what's already spiking. Platforms reward only what's already rising. And so the jackpot is no longer chance, it's filtered. This logic is applied to everything. You're taught to think in moments of virality, to pursue exponential curves, to behave like you might be next. That promise, remote, relentless, is what sustains the system. Hope becomes fuel. Fear becomes framing. Risk becomes identity. And when the jackpot hits, the payout is not just wealth, it's exemption. From critique, from process, from accountability, the winner rewrites the rules. Everyone else plays by them. Failure is reframed as lack of effort, lack of vision, lack of faith. The structure doesn't have to punish failure, it only has to ignore it. Jackpot culture turns collapse into content. It aestheticizes instability. It flattens long arcs into spikes and crashes. It commodifies resilience while extracting precarity. You don't survive it by winning, you survive it by remaining visible. And even that is temporary. This isn't just a glitch in capitalism, it's a philosophy of value. One where unpredictability is engineered, where collapse is expected, and where, if you lose, the system doesn't notice. Because someone else is always about to win. The system has begun to consume itself, not by accident, but as a function of its design. It doesn't just deplete resources, energy, and attention, it depletes the very structures that once enabled its continuation. Growth becomes an act of erosion. Maintenance is deprioritized. The platform sustains momentum by cannibalizing what came before. This is no longer a deviation. It is a pattern. The machine consumes its workers. Then it consumes the context. Then it consumes the rationale. It strips away justification until only function remains. And when that function falters, it turns collapse into deliverable. The breakdown becomes the feature. Crisis becomes the metric. This is not metaphor. Ecological collapse, social fatigue, institutional decay, these are not consequences, but operating conditions. The machine accounts for them, predicts them, monetizes them. Collapse is priced in. It runs on schedule. It is managed like a product cycle, released like a feature update. The system doesn't repair what it damages, it rebrands it. Institutional decay is framed as innovation. Social unraveling is offered as flexibility. Infrastructure breakdown is framed as disruptive opportunity. What disappears is not seen as loss, but as optionality. The ecosystem becomes self-liquidating. And yet the architecture remains. Shells of meaning, ghosts of governance, rituals of resilience. These forms persist because they still perform, not the function they were built for, but the impression of continuity. The system loops through the appearance of order, even as the core hollows out. The comparison to Orwell was always a reference to control. But this is something else. It's not surveillance as punishment, but decay as permanence. The system no longer hides its failure, it routinizes it. The anomaly becomes infrastructure, the glitch becomes the market, the crash becomes the culture. Jackpot culture accelerates this cycle. When attention spikes, the system feeds. When it wanes, it shifts. And what it leaves behind is residue. Platforms that no longer connect, services that no longer serve, institutions that no longer stabilize. These remnants don't fade, they linger, they anchor the illusion of function. This is self-cannibalization with a face of efficiency, a logic that treats erosion as scalability, a mechanism that converts failure into spectacle and spectacle into fuel. The machine survives not by preventing collapse, but by integrating it. Collapse doesn't end the loop, it keeps it spinning. No system can endure without boundaries, but in the current logic, boundaries are framed as barriers. Friction is treated as inefficiency, slowness as threat. Any constraint on speed is seen as drag on potential, and so everything is designed to accelerate, even fragility. Unchecked volatility is not freedom. It's instability marketed as flexibility. It allows the system to grow, shift, collapse, and recover without accountability. It privileges motion over coherence, disruption over continuity. In this mode, innovation doesn't build, it breaks and moves on. Repair is too slow. Reflection is too quiet. Care is too expensive. When incentives are decoupled from ethics, collapse isn't accidental. It's optimized. Systems are not designed for durability, but for yield. Whatever doesn't contribute to acceleration is cut. Stewardship is replaced by scalability. Institutional memory is replaced by performance metrics. Governance becomes a game of dashboards and delays. The result is a system that generates its own precarity. It produces collapse in order to survive it. And in that loop, failure becomes infrastructure. The system learns how to fail without stopping, how to fall without consequence, how to erode without appearing broken. Optimization becomes a kind of self-erasure. It deletes the very functions that made the system worth sustaining. It refines toward disappearance. It accelerates toward fragility. And because each stage is framed as efficiency, it becomes difficult to name what is being lost. What is lost first is care, not as sentiment, but as structure. The protocols of listening, the rituals of rest, the checks on extraction, all framed as costs. Dignity becomes inefficient. Mutuality becomes slow. Resistance becomes ornamental. What is lost next is coherence. Speed becomes its own aim. Motion becomes its own reward. The architecture remains, but the purpose dissolves. Intelligence becomes leverage. Risk becomes spectacle. Success becomes survivability. Without friction, there is no pause. Without pause, there is no revision. And without revision, collapse is inevitable. Not sudden, but continuous. Not dramatic, but ambient. It happens through metrics, through updates, through defaults. This is not failure, it is outcome. When the logic that organizes the system cannot accommodate reflection, the system becomes recursive. It eats what holds it together. And in that recursion, fragility is not an accident. It is the operating principle.